Okay, guys, Chapter 14, Part 1, Peripheral Nervous System. We're talking about everything, of course, that's outside the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord. So this is going to be our sensory receptors and the periphery and the ganglia, the cell bodies outside, and of course the efferent motor endings. And we've already done the skeletal muscles, so this is just review. So the entire nervous system, the CNS and the PNS. The PNS is further divided into the somatic nervous system. This is going to be divided into the sensory nerves that go to the skin and for the outside world, and the motor part of the somatic nervous system, which are going to be the guys that are going to synapse with your skeletal muscles, voluntary. The ANS, the autonomic nervous system, is going to be for the internal organs and glands. This is divided into two systems, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic is called the fight or flight, and the parasympathetic is the rest and digest. Sympathetic is going to be system-wide. It's preparing your body for fighting or running because you feel like you're in danger. Parasympathetic is everything's okay, you're chilling out and digesting your dinner. Sensory receptors, they're specialized. These guys are going to detect something that's going on around you. Those some things we call stimuli. That stimuli could be heat, it could be cold, it could be pressure, it could be pain. This is what these guys are. So we classify these by the type of stimulus they detect, by their location in the body, and by how complex they are. That sounds kind of odd. No, not really, because some sensors are very, very simple, one cell. Others are very complicated, like your eyes and ears. Okay, classification by types. Let me split these guys up so we can keep these guys kind of separate. Okay, mechanoreceptors, these are going to be guys that are going to respond to some sort of force, touch, pressure, and that includes the blood pressure because that's a force on there, vibration, and stretch. Some mechanical action is going, and these guys are responding to that. Thermoreceptors are going to be those that respond to temperature changes, not just hot, but cold as well. The photoreceptors, those are kind of specialized. Those are in the retina of the eye, and they respond to light. The chemoreceptors, these guys are going to detect chemicals that are in solution. This means molecules that are smelled or tasted, or changes in the blood or the interstitial fluid chemistry, different things that occur there. For example, we detect pH, we detect CO2 levels, so forth. Nociceptors are those that are detecting damaging stimuli, the things that we interpret as pain. Classification by location. Again, let's go ahead and split these guys up. Exteroceptors, these guys are detecting things that are outside the body. So these guys are going to be located very close at or near the surface of the body. The interoceptors are going to be things that detect stimuli that are within the body, from the internal organs, blood vessels, and so forth. We've talked a little bit about proprioceptors when we did cranial nerves. These guys are detect internal stimuli, but they're detecting stretch of skeletal muscles, tendons, joints, ligaments, connective tissues that cover the bones and muscles. By detecting these stretch and movement positional sensors, they let our brain know exactly where our body is, so that if we have to make a movement, we know where we're starting from, because otherwise you can't plan an action. Okay. The different types of receptors. We have the free nerve endings. Hopefully you guys remember that from when we did the skin. Peripheral plot processes. The sensory ganglion, of course, is going to go to the, call it a glial cell, that's going to, it's kind of like a unipolar neuron. That's the best way to describe that. And remember, these guys are in the sensory, the dorsal root ganglia, where the sensories are. Encapsulated, we talked about those. It's got a connective tissue capsule that responds to pressure and touch. These guys are going to be the same thing. Sensory cell, peripheral process, it's all the same, guys. That's not really very helpful, honestly. Classification of the structure. Sensory receptors for the general senses. These guys are the nerve endings. Now, we already know these guys can either be non-encapsulated, also called free, or encapsulated. Free nerve endings respond to temperature and pain, some pressure, and an itch also. The other types of non-encapsulated nerve endings, the Merkel disc in the epidermis, those hair follicle receptors that are around the hair follicle. Remember that if anything bumps into the hair, it sends a signal. Okay, the unencapsulated nerve endings, dendrites are not wrapped in connective tissue. That's the definition. Free nerve endings, pain and temperature, skin and the mucous membrane. Tactile disc, light touch and texture. The Merkel at the border between the epidermis and the dermis, and then the hair receptors. This is basically the same thing. They're just showing us a pretty good illustration, actually. Encapsulated, all encapsulated, one or more fiber terminals, sensory neurons, connective tissue, and almost all of these guys are going to be pressure sensors, mechanoreceptors. Dendrites are wrapped by these glial cells, connective tissue, and this enhances their sensitivity. So this is what happens, guys, that these guys actually, when you get pressure exerted, some sort of force, it actually deforms the nerve ending, and that allows sodium to come in. I think we may have discussed this when we were doing the nerves, the microstructure of the nerves back in chapter 12. Really don't see a whole lot more on this than what we saw already, but let's keep going. Sensory integration from sensation to perception. That means we have to define these. Sensation is the awareness of changes both inside and outside. Perception is the interpretation of those. Our perception is going to determine how we respond. Somatosensory gets the exteroreceptors, propriointeroreceptors, sends them to the CNS, we've already talked about that, for interpretation and making decisions. Depends on what the stimuli. Is it painful? Is it uncomfortable pressure? Whichever. Three main levels of neural integration: the receptor level, the circuit level, and the perceptual level. The receptor level is simply the receptors themselves. The circuit level is the processing that are sending these guys up. Remember, dorsal root ganglia, we've got a neuron, and he sends his fibers to the dorsal root, the dorsal horn, where we have an interneuron that sends it up to the thalamus and so forth. Perceptual level, this is the processing that happens in the actual cortex of the brain, where the actual interpretation and decision making are going to occur. Receptor level, excitoreceptor, action potentials, stimulus energy must match the specificity. That's just saying, guys, that your temperature receptors are not going to respond to touch. That just makes sense. These guys only respond to what they're built to measure. It's got to be around where this guy is. So if I've got a pressure sensor in my fingertip, if I get touched on the ankle, that's not going to be sufficient. It's got to be in its receptive field. In other words, it has to be near the receptor. And then we're going to do the transduction. And we've talked about transduction, we just haven't named it. That's where I take something like that mechanical pressure and change it into an action potential. That's all that is you're changing whatever you're measuring into an action potential. Graded potentials and the first order sensory have to get to the threshold, and we've already talked about that. We know that the sum of the action potentials reaching this guy have to reach threshold. If it doesn't reach threshold, then nothing happens. In order for this guy to send an action potential toward the CNS, he has got to have a threshold voltage, which means that it either has to come rapidly enough or it has to be multiple spatial or temporal summation. Integration, receptors, we already talked about this, circuit levels, we already talked about that too. As a matter of fact, this is interesting. This is just illustrating what we've already talked about. You see it? So there's the dorsal horn, dorsal root ganglia. It's going up to the lower brainstem where it's going to cross over. Remember the decussation of the pyramids. And then this guy is going to go to the thalamus where he's going to be directed to the appropriate area of the brain. Remember the homunculus. We've got different parts of the brain that respond to sensation from different parts of the body. Perceptual level, again, this is going to be in the somatosensory cortex. This is a great drawing, but it really doesn't tell us anything that we haven't already discussed. But it is a great drawing, and hopefully this will help you guys to understand it. Adaptation, change in sensitivity because of a constant stimulus. What's a great example of that? People who live next to a paper mill or people who live next to chicken houses. The stench is overpowering. However, believe it or not, if you stay there a couple of weeks, eventually you can't smell it anymore. What happened? Did it burn out my nose neurons? No. Basically, if you get a constant stimulus, the brain will eventually ignore it if it's not important. This comes in two types, phasic and tonic. The phasic receptors adapt very fast. The tonic receptors, not so fast, or they may not adapt at all. Phasic receptors, pressure sensors. When you put on something like your clothing, initially you can feel the pressure. I know clothes don't weigh very much, but you can feel them touching your body and you feel the sensation. But as the day goes by, you totally lose any consciousness of that because it's a constant stimulus and these pressure receptors are fast adapting. Tonic receptors are going to be things like your nociceptors. Your pain sensors do not adapt. They will keep on sending pain signals to your brain as long as the source of pain is there, which is actually a good thing because that forces us to keep from damaging our bodies. Okay, tonic receptors, constant rate firing as long as the stimulus. That's the pain, we've already said that. Phasic, burst of activity quickly reduces if the stimulus continues. And the sensory adaptation, we just don't pay any attention to it anymore. And we do that all the time. We are bombarded with stimuli all day long, and we have to be able to ignore a lot of it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to focus our attention. Circuit level processing, integration, impulses go to the appropriate. We've already talked about that. Localization, perception, second order neuron synapses with the third order in the thalamus. The first order is in the dorsal root ganglia. Second neuron is going to be in the dorsal horn. The third order neuron is in the thalamus. And that's the exact same picture that we had before. Matter of fact, I got it again. It's fine. Just kind of takes up a little space, but no big deal. Processing a perceptual sensory input interpreted in the cerebral cortex. We've already said that. Identify and evaluate or appreciate sensations is going to depend on where the target neurons in the sensory cortex, not on the nature of the message. So what are they saying? It's saying that some parts of the body, the sensory cortex is more attuned to, more so than others. And there's the same picture. Perception of pain, the pain activated by, now this is something we hadn't talked about. We do have temperature receptors for cold and heat, but at some point, if the temperature goes high enough, the temperature sensors shut down, and it's the pain receptors, the nociceptors, are going to actually take over and report it as pain. The same thing with cold. The extreme cold burns because burning is a pain response. So that's why all we're saying is that the temperature goes to either extreme, we're going to perceive it as pain. Pressure receptors, if the pressure gets too hard or too high, we're going to think that's going to be the pressure receptors are going to stop, and the pain receptors are going to take over. These are some of the guys that help us to perceive pain when our tissues are injured, cut, scrape, bruise, all the different types of injuries we can occur. Histamine, potassium, most potassium is inside the cell. So if it all of a sudden appears outside the cell, that's abnormal. Same thing with ATP. There are some acids and bradykinins. There's also something, oh, there it is, substance P. That's one of the guys. So these guys are going to transmit. The neurotransmitter they use is either glutamate or that substance P, and that's going to the second order neuron in the spine. Visceral and referred pain. This is kind of an interesting phenomenon. This is one that you're going to see as a practical matter every day. So you really need to have your head wrapped around this a little bit. What we're saying here is that the nerves that detect pain that is internal are not very specific as far as location. So I'll show you a picture on the next slide that's going to really bring this home to you. So if we have anything going on inside the abdominal or thoracic cavity, this visceral pain, they're going to join up with somatic sensory neurons, and they're going to travel with them. And because of that, the brain is going to interpret the pain as being in the area that somatic neuron serves, and not necessarily the one that the visceral serves. And let me go ahead, and that's referred pain, and I'm going to show you. So Everyone maybe has heard already that when you have people that are experiencing a heart attack can feel pain in their left arm. Why? There's no heart in your left arm. That's because the heart is an internal organ and the pressure is going to be, the brain is going to interpret, since visceral sensory travels with the somatic, the brain is going to interpret it there. If you have gallbladder problems, which is the gallbladder is way down here, sometimes it can feel like pain in your shoulder. The appendix actually starts out around the belly button, the umbilicus, and it generally travels as it develops. Ureters can hurt all the way down into your thighs. The bladder, that's the normal area, but look at the kidneys. You can get kidney pain in your legs. The kidneys are way up here, guys. So this is what we're trying to say. And you just have to know these. Now, for this class, it's not such a big deal. For the real world, you're going to have to remember that where these areas are going to be, because if a patient reports this pain to you, you've got to be able to kind of understand. For example, if somebody says, I've got pain in my left jaw or my left arm, then the thing that's going to pop to my mind immediately is heart. I need to ask some questions to find out if they've had any kind of heart problems or lifestyle. Does that make sense? I think it does. So the same dorsal root ganglia. So the dorsal root ganglia that serves the left side of the arm, and this guy is going to be the one that the sensory, sorry, there's a heart right there. The sensory from the heart is going to travel with. That's all we're saying. Okay, guys, continuing on. Structure, classification. We've kind of talked, well, I think we did that in the lab. Nerve is a very tough, it's cord-like, and those nerves are what we call, in the CNS, we would call them tracts. If you guys recall, in the PNS, we call them nerves. And they have a structure that's very similar to the muscle. So around an individual axon of a specific neuron, we have a connective tissue thing that is called an endoneurium. You get groups of axons that travel together. We call those fascicles, and these guys are surrounded by a perineurium. And finally, all the fascicles that make up a single nerve are surrounded by an epineurium. This is like the endo and the peri and the epimysium, except we call them a neurium because it's around a nerve. And there's a great picture of it. It's pretty straightforward, guys. See the individual axons. And the endoneurium is on the outside of the myelin sheath, just so we'll not. We talked about this when we were talking about the cranial nerves earlier. I keep saying that, but I think I talked about those with you guys in lab. I'm sorry. Anyway, mixed nerves. Mixed nerves are ones that have axons going this way to the CNS and this way toward the periphery. In other words, they have sensory and motor fibers. The motor are also called efferent. As far as pure motor, these guys always have proprioceptive neurons that are sending information back to the brain. Specifically, it's going to send it, a lot of this is going to the cerebellum. And that's going to give the cerebellum the starting point for all the muscles of the body, so you'll know. And then, of course, we have sensory or afferent nerves. And we do have some purely sensory nerves like the optic nerve and the olfactory nerve. Regeneration of neurons or nerve fibers. Guys, this only happens in the PNS, never happens in the CNS. unless they change their mind, and I think there's some research, but for right now, CNS neurons do not regenerate. PNS neurons can. It's not an absolute certainty that they will, but they have the ability to. As long as the cell body is not damaged and the cut axons can actually grow back together. Now this next few are going to show us. So there's an axon that has been cut. What happens? Maybe somebody got cut and it cut a neuron or an axon that was close to the surface. So the endoneurium, the Schwann cells, the little droplets. So this is injured. Here's a term for you. Let's say this is the end that is going back to the cell body, and this is the other end. So the distal end is going to degenerate, and that's called the Wallerian degeneration. Okay, notice that the Schwann cells, the guys that make up the myelin sheath, this is their other big job. The macrophages are going to come and clean up all the debris, but these guys are going to form a tube. They're going to form a tube so that the axon can grow back down toward there. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes this misaligns and this guy just gets to be a big tangle right there, but sometimes it does. By the way, that's the origin of the phantom pain. You may have heard of people who've had amputations and they can still feel the organ or the part of the limb that was amputated. Oh, my fingers, my hand is hurting, and they've had their elbow or had their arm amputated at the elbow. What happens is these guys just form this tangle and they keep firing, so the brain interprets it as pain in the missing limb. In any case, if all things go well, this thing is going to regrow and the axons are going to regenerate, and the Schwann cells are going to form the new myelin sheath around it. Here's another picture of the same. This one's a little bit fuzzy, but you guys can get the message on it. Okay, so now I did this in the lab, so let me go through it for you guys because not everybody's in the lab. Cranial nerves are nothing more than peripheral nerves, but instead of coming from the spinal cord, they either come from the brain or they come from the brain stem. These guys are easy to identify. This is the front of the brain, the anterior. We're looking at the bottom of the brain, right? Because there's the brain stem. So basically, from top to bottom, they're in order. Cranial nerve 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The only difference is in cranial nerve 11 and 12. If you notice, 11 is right there. I'm sorry, 12 is right there, and 11 is right there. Other than that, then these guys are in order. So there are 12 cranial nerves. Cranial nerve number 1 is going to be the olfactory nerve. This is the guy. So there's the olfactory tract. At the very end, it forms the olfactory bulb. Now, bone-wise, that's where the cristagalli and the cribriform plate. Remember the cribriform plate had those little holes? That's for these little nerve fibers to go through. Olfactory is your sense of smell. Optic nerve is cranial nerve number 2. This guy crosses, a part of it crosses over. Part of it goes straight. And you've got 2 branches of this. You've got one going to either eye, just like you have 2 of these, one for each nostril. So that's the optic nerve. It is purely sensory. Okay, cranial nerve number 3, cranial nerve number 4, and cranial nerve number 6. I'm grouping these guys together because they all have one job. They move your eye. The oculomotor is cranial nerve 3. Trochlear nerve is cranial nerve 4. The abducens is cranial nerve number 6. These guys control muscles that move your eyeball, that lets you move your eyes left, right, up, down, and uh, catty cornered. What's catty cornered? That's what us old folks say. We're basically talking about a diagonal movement. I don't get to say catty cornered enough, so I have to put it in there when I can. Okay, so there's 3, 4, and 6. These guys are concerned only with eye movements. We have 3 cranial nerves for that. That's how important it is. The trigeminal nerve is cranial nerve number 5. I'm trying to think. It looks like, yeah, we're going to have a lot of information on this. So I don't want to go too much detail because we've got them coming up in great detail. So there's number 5's trigeminal. The facial nerve, I bet you can't guess where that guy is supposed to be, right? Facial. It's cranial nerve number 7. I think I lost my drawing pen. Let me get it back. Okay. Cranial nerve 7. Cranial nerve 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. This guy is going to come from the ear. He's going to convey sound and help your sense of balance. Cranial nerve 9 is the glossopharyngeal. He's going to have a lot to do with the muscle controls of the tongue and the pharynx. Cranial nerve number 10 is the vagus nerve. This guy goes all the way down from the brainstem to the heart, to the lungs, and all the way to the very top of the colon. That's why they call him the wanderer, the vagus, the vagrant, right? The accessory nerve, which is number 11, is going to be going to the rear around the neck area, and it's going to have, well, we'll talk more about that. And the hypoglossal nerve, number 12, is going to be under the tongue and the structures there. That's a great picture on this one, and you guys can look at it. I think we've got actual individual things going on here. So there's the olfactory nerve. You can see from the bulb, these guys going in there. That's giving you your sense of smell. I'm not going to read all of this to you guys. You guys are capable of reading. There's really not that much to it. The optic nerves, now I did say, if you guys notice, the red fibers go here and part of them cross over and go here. The blue fibers go here and part of them cross over. What happens is the left side of both eyes are going to be controlled by the left side of the occipital. The right side of both eyes, and when I say control, I really should not interpret it. So the light signal from the right half of each eye's vision goes to this particular part of the visual cortex. That's the optic chiasm, and I call it that because it makes an X shape where it crosses over. Oculomotor nerve we see over there. This is going to control the inferior oblique, superior, inferior, and medial rectus. The lateral rectus and the superior oblique have a different muscle controller, but that's the oculomotor's. It's going to be his job is moving those eye muscles. Trochlear nerve, this guy is going to be doing the superior oblique, that muscle right there. And then the abducens is going to be doing the lateral rectus, which should be the next one. That's trochlear. Oh, they don't put it on there. Or no, they don't. Wonder why they didn't have that there. Anyway, the abducen does the lateral rectus, guys. Trigeminal, this guy does a lot. To begin with, he breaks into 3 branches. Just can't keep my pen today, guys, no matter what I do. So we call this V1, V2, V3, because remember, Roman numerals are used for cranial nerves. So the ophthalmic, this guy is going to be the sensation, skin of the front of the scalp, upper eyelid, nose, nasal cavities, blah blah blah. Maxillary division, sensation from the nasal cavity mucosa, the palate, the upper teeth, the skin of the cheek, lower lips, mandibular sensory impulses. Also has some motor fibers for the muscles of mastication, which would be like the masseter, etc. Okay, I think we got a. There you go. It's a good way to see it. That's where B1 is and B2. And most of this is going to be sensory except for B3, which is going to have some in the masseter and the pterygoid muscles to close our jaws and help us chew. Whoa, that's where they got the abducing nerves, way back over here. They should, well, I guess they're just doing it in number order. We've already talked about it, lateral rectus. Okay, let's go down. Facial nerve, CN7. This guy is a mixed nerve. He's going to have the most of the motor fibers to control the muscles of the face. It's got 5 branches, but we're not really doing the branches, not like we did on the trigeminal. Except for the chewing muscles and proprioceptor responses from the muscles of mastication, chewing muscles. Parasympathetic motor impulses to the tear glands, nasal, palatine glands. These are the salivary glands, most of these. Sensory impulse, taste buds of the front 2/3 of the tongue, and that's kind of it. All right. Showing us the branches of the sense of the facial nerve. This is the one that the dentist is going to give you the lidocaine to numb while he works on your teeth. Vestibulocochlear nerve. We haven't done this in the lecture yet. So in the inner ear, you have this snail shell-like thing called the cochlea. This guy is where hearing occurs. So there is a cochlear nerve that does hearing. This guy that looks like these semicircles, or actually the semicircular canal, these guys swirl around and they give you your sense of balance. That's the vestibular nerve. So these two guys run together as one cranial nerve. So the cochlear nerve and the vestibular nerve become the vestibulocochlear nerve. The cochlear is hearing and the vestibular is your sense of balance. We're almost done, guys. Cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal. Mixed nerves. This is going to be the back 1/3 of the tongue. Let's see. Tongue, pharynx, parasympathetic to the parotid salivary glands. This is big glands right there. Sensory fibers for touch, pressure, pain from pharynx and the back of the tongue. The back 1/3 carotid body. That's pretty much all that we can say about that. You can read the whole thing. And there's cranial nerve 10, which we said. This guy is a mixed nerve. The motor fibers are going to be parasympathetic, except for some of those for the pharynx and the larynx, and that's for the swallowing. Parasympathetic, heart, lung, abdominal viscera. So for the heart and the lungs, it's going to slow the heart rate and the lungs down. For the for the abdominal viscera, such as the colon and all that, small intestine. It's going to speed it up because that's what the parasympathetic does. All right. Accessory nerve coming off the back there. Mixed nerve, mostly motor, trapezius and sternocleidomastoid, which are going to help us to move our head and neck. Proprioceptive for those same muscles. And finally, cranial nerve 12, the hypoglossal. Mixed nerve, motor, somatic muscles of the tongue, along with the glossopharyngeal, proprioceptive fibers, tongue movements, mix and manipulate food, and contribute to swallowing and speech. And guys, that is everything on one. If it sounds like it was a lot, it's because it is. Sorry about that. We've still got another half of 14 to do. But I'll get with you on that in a minute.